The next item on the agenda is a decision item on a proposed regulatory document, REGDOC-2.2.4, fitness for duty, worker managing worker fatigue as outlined in CMD 16-70 and 16M 17.A. I understand that somebody from staff will present it. It doesn't say who here, so please identify yourself.
Bonjour, Monsieur le Président, membres de la Commission. My name is Karen Owen-Wittred, Director of the Regulatory Framework Division. With me today are Greg Lamar, Director General, Directorate of Safety Management, André Bouchard, Director of the Human and Organizational Performance Division, and Helen McRobbie, Human and Organizational Factor Specialist from the Human and Organizational Performance Division. We are here today to request that REGDOC-2.2.4, Fitness for Duty, Managing Worker Fatigue, be approved for publication and use by CNSC staff in assessing the acceptability of licensees' provisions for managing worker fatigue. Before turning the presentation to Monsieur Bouchard, I will briefly review where REGDOC 2.2.4 is situated within the CNSC's regulatory document framework. To enhance accessibility of our regulatory expectations, the CNSC structures our regulatory documents according to the framework shown here. This slide shows where REGDOC 2.2.4 fits into the CNSC's broader document framework. It is situated within Section 2.2, Human Performance Management. Fitness for duty is going to be addressed in two different regulatory documents. The one we are presenting today focuses on worker fatigue. In March, we will be presenting a second regulatory document addressing fitness for duty more broadly. I would now like to turn the presentation over to Monsieur Bouchard.
Thank you. Bonjour. Mon nom est André Bouchard. I am speaking to you today in my capacity as the Director of the Human and Organizational Performance Division, which is the technical lead for this document. During today's presentation, staff will identify the objectives of the regulatory document and the rationale. We will describe the history of the CNSC's actions addressing workers' fatigue and the input considered as the document was developed. We will take you through the public consultation process, identify some of the key themes from the comments received, and provide you with an overview of the content of the document. The presentation will close with a discussion about implementation, staff's conclusions, and recommendation to approve the REGDOC 2.2.4 for publication. REGDOC 2.2.4, Managing Workers' Fatigue, sets out CNSC's proposed requirements and guidance for managing fatigue-related risks at high-security sites across Canada. The REGDOC will provide a consistent, transparent, risk-informed basis for licensing and compliance activities. The objective of these requirements is to minimize the potential for fatigue-related errors that could affect nuclear safety and security. I will now turn the presentation over to Ms. McRobbie.
Good afternoon. I am Helen McRobbie, and I am a Human and Organizational Factors Specialist with the Human and Organizational Performance Division at the CNSC. The CNSC focuses on risks associated with human performance because workers are a key contributor to nuclear safety and security. The workforce at nuclear plants is well trained and highly skilled. There is a minimum number of people with the right qualifications on site at all times who can address any operational or security issues that may arise. Some of these workers are certified by the CNSC because of the direct impact they can have on nuclear safety. The general nuclear safety and control regulations require licensees to ensure the presence of a sufficient number of qualified workers. It is implicit in this requirement that workers must be fit for duty. Science shows that fatigue can degrade a wide variety of cognitive abilities, ranging from vigilance to decision-making. The effects of fatigue have been called cognitive slowing. Fatigue changes a person's brain functioning. No matter how well qualified a person is, fatigue can degrade his performance. Fatigue has been identified as a factor in high-profile events in various industries. Researchers have also pointed out that many high-profile events have happened in the middle of the night, and fatigue was likely a factor. Due to the effects of fatigue on performance, risks related to fatigue must be effectively managed. The CNSC's limits on hours of work address 3 types of fatigue. Acute fatigue is caused by extended hours awake or restricted sleep short term. Research consistently shows significant performance declines after approximately 17 hours awake. A daily limit on hours of work and minimum daily recovery periods are aimed at limiting acute fatigue. Cumulative fatigue is caused by mild sleep restriction over a series of days that results in insufficient recovery from acute fatigue. Research shows that performance impairments increase as sleep loss accumulates across consecutive days. Cumulative fatigue is addressed through limits to the number of consecutive shifts and recovery periods. Night work poses a greater risk for fatigue than day work due to the body's natural rhythm that varies over a 24-hour period, known as the circadian rhythm. People experience fatigue when they work through the night because the body's natural tendency is to sleep at night. Night workers may also struggle to sleep during the day since the body's natural tendency is to be awake. Recovery from fatigue requires sufficient sleep. To summarize this slide, a person's work schedule can affect fatigue because it sets the boundaries for the timing and duration of sleep. With this regulatory document, the CNSC will formalize its position on fatigue and provide clear, enforceable, and risk-informed requirements for the management of fatigue. This includes expectations related to 12-hour shifts. Although other jurisdictions in Canada have some limits on hours of work, no other Canadian regulator addresses fatigue and hours of work for the purpose of ensuring nuclear safety and security. Lastly, fatigue is one of the impairment risks that affects fitness for duty, and it needs to be addressed as part of the CNSC's regulatory initiative for strengthening oversight of fitness for duty. The CNSC has been active in the area of worker fatigue for many years. Nuclear reactors have certain workers who must be on site at all times. Round-the-clock coverage used to be achieved by 3 8-hour shifts instead of 2 12-hour shifts, as is done today. Ontario Hydro was the first licensee to request the Atomic Energy Control Board's approval to change from 8-hour to 12-hour shifts in the 1980s. At that time, Ontario Hydro included what is now Ontario Power Generation and Bruce Power. During Ontario Hydro's trial period of 12-hour shifts, the AECB hired a research consulting company to prepare a report based on scientific literature and on Ontario Hydro's experience during the trial period. When the AECB accepted Ontario Hydro's change to 12-hour shifts, it issued a letter specifying that certain limits on work schedules had to be included in the licensee's procedures. These limits on work schedules were based on the expert advice provided in the research report. Since that time, CNSC staff have conducted oversight activities to assess licensee compliance with their hours of work procedures. These oversight activities have identified opportunities to clarify regulatory expectations and to improve consistency between licensees. Since 2009, nuclear power plant hours of work procedures have been referenced as compliance verification criteria in their license condition handbooks. The development of this regulatory document is an evolution based on this history. There are three key inputs to the regulatory document. The first input is research. Staff have considered 3 reports carried out by research consulting companies for the CNSC and research reports conducted by licensees. In addition, staff have reviewed literature, some of which is summarized in the synopsis of science and benchmarking included in the CMD package. Research considered has come from a broad range of industries, including transportation, mining, petrochemical, and defense. Secondly, CNSC staff have benchmarked against other regulators in Canada and with nuclear regulators internationally, and have incorporated best practices into the regulatory document. The third input to the REGDOC is feedback received during public consultation. Staff considered public consultation comments in light of scientific information, risk, and benchmarking. I will now turn the presentation to Monsieur Bouchard to discuss public consultation.
André Bouchard for the record. Staff has consulted extensively on this regulatory document. Public consultation occurred in 2 phases. The reasons for 2 phases is that the regulatory document was changed significantly in phase 1, and the CNSC staff determined that the revised document should be posted for full public consultation a second time around. Key activities in each phases of the consultation are shown in this slide. The numbering changed from REGDOC-2.2.1 in phase 1 consultation to 2.2.4 in phase 2 is related to the revised regulatory framework numbering system. Staff has gained a better understanding of stakeholders' position through the range of consultation activities conducted. The outcome of the consultation activity is that many concerns raised by stakeholders have been addressed. I will now provide an overview of the themes emerging during the public consultation. There were 4 key themes: the workers' population, prescriptive limits on hours of work, exceptional circumstances, and the potential for administrative burden. I will discuss each of these themes in the next slides. The initial draft regulatory document included 1 population and all requirements applied to this single group. Based on what we heard during the consultation, CNSC staff modified the approach in the second draft of the REGDOC to include a graded approach with 2 populations. The programmatic fatigue management provisions would apply to the broad population of workers who have the potential through their work activities to pose the risks to nuclear safety or security. The limits on hours of work would apply to a smaller subset of workers who fill safety-sensitive position. A person in a safety-sensitive position has a role where impaired performance could result in a significant incident. Safety-sensitive position will be identified by licensee through a risk-informed analysis. However, the regulatory document specifies that this population must include staff certified by the CNSC, certain security personnel, and members of the minimum staff complement, unless they are excluded by the risk-informed analysis. The REGDOC also includes guidance to clarify that licensee may exclude workers from the broad population if they do not have the potential through their work activities to pose risks to nuclear safety or security. An example might be the administrative staff. An excluded worker would still fall under applicable provincial or federal hours of work limits. The second consultation theme relates to the limits on hours of work. Stakeholders provided comments about certain limits during both rounds of consultation and the apparent lack of a graded approach. As a result of comments received, the requirements have been modified to further focus on the highest risks aspect of shift work, which are long work days, night work, and long work weeks. The regulatory document now includes two populations, and the limits on hours of work apply to those who fill safety-sensitive positions. This constitutes the first dimension of a graded approach. The second aspect of the graded approach built into the REGDOC is the flexibility for licensee to choose between 8, 10, or 12-hour shifts. The complexity and the prescriptiveness is proportionate to the increasing fatigue potential that is linked with the length of work days and night work. The third consultation theme relates to exceptional circumstances. The REGDOC recognized that the licensee may have to exceed limits on hours of work during exceptional circumstances, such as severe weather. The REGDOC also includes guidance about measures that licensees should implement during these exceptional circumstances, including those when workers must remain on site for longer than 16 hours. Examples of these measures are providing reasonable accommodations for workers to obtain restorative sleep and delaying non-essential activities. The REGDOC also includes record-keeping requirements during exceptional circumstances. Records would enable CNSC staff to maintain oversight of these occurrences. The final theme in the potential is the potential for administrative burden. The document has been modified in a variety of ways with the intent of reducing the administrative burden while not compromising safety. As already described, the most significant changes is applying the limits of hours of work and recovery period to a smaller group of workers who fill safety-sensitive positions. The requirement in the REGDOC focus on the greatest risk factor for fatigue in work schedules, which are, as we said, night work, long work days, and long work weeks. Some advice practices were moved to guidance. As an example, the expectations that daily hours should normally be less than 13 was moved to guidance, while the requirements of 16 hours of work in a 24-hour period was maintained. In addition, some of the changes requested by stakeholders to match licensees' current practices were incorporated into the REGDOC. Stakeholders also raised a concern about the administrative burden of providing immediate reports of non-compliances with the limits. Reporting provisions are set in other REGDOCs like 3.1.1. Reporting requirements for nuclear power plants. REGDOC-2.2.4 does not set reporting requirements on its own. REGDOC 3.3.1 currently requires a quarterly report of non-compliances with limits of hours of work for certified staff. I will now turn the presentation over to Ms. McRoby to describe the content of the REGDOC.
Helen McRoby for the record. The regulatory document is divided into two sections. The first section includes fatigue risk management elements that apply to the broad population of workers. The second section includes limits on hours of work that apply to a smaller set of workers who fill safety-sensitive positions. This slide provides an overview of the programmatic fatigue management elements included in the REGDOC. The programmatic elements have been identified through a research report prepared for the CNSC in 2013 and through research and benchmarking with other industries. These elements are consistent with licensee management systems and the Canadian Standards Association N286 management system requirements, but add specificity related to fatigue management. The programmatic elements are also consistent with the upcoming Fitness for Duty REGDOC that will be presented to the Commission in March of 2017. Staff want to highlight that the problem identification and resolution section has been based on a best practice from the Transportation Safety Board. The Transportation Safety Board is an independent body that investigates transportation events. When they investigate events, they look at work schedules and the role of fatigue. The problem identification and resolution section draws on the method used by the Transportation Safety Board. The second section of the REGDOC, which applies to workers who fill safety-sensitive positions, includes limits on hours of work and recovery periods. The goal of the limits is ensuring workers have sufficient sleep opportunities. Research shows 4 ways to achieve this goal. On the far left, people must be provided with sufficient time for sleep daily. The second box relates to consecutive shifts. If people get less sleep than they need daily, a sleep debt occurs. Performance declines proportionally as the sleep debt builds across consecutive days. The intent of restricting consecutive shifts is to limit the buildup of sleep debt. The third box relates to time off. Research shows people sleep more on days free from work. Time off gives people time to recover. When night shifts are worked, this time off also allows people's circadian rhythm to return to a day schedule. The final box in this framework shows limiting average weekly hours as a safeguard against cumulative fatigue. As hours worked during a week increase, research shows that people sleep less and are more likely to experience errors and accidents. Underlying this framework is the timing of work. It is clear from research that night work poses a greater risk for fatigue than day work. This framework was used in the performance-based requirements that apply to the broad population. The requirements in the REGDOC set a maximum number of work hours within 24 and 48 hours. Research reports conducted for the CNSC have stressed the importance of a daily limit on hours of work of 16 hours. The 2-day limit is intended to prevent 2 consecutive 16-hour shifts. The REGDOC includes a recovery period of at least 8 consecutive hours between shifts. It also includes guidance that the recovery period should normally be 11 hours, so people have a sleep opportunity in the range of 7 to 8 hours daily. Some benchmarking data is included in this slide. The REGDOC also includes limits applicable to a week and to a longer-term period. The original REGDOC included a limit of 60 hours in a 7-day period. Some stakeholders asked for clarity that this is a fixed period. Other stakeholders asked for some added flexibility by making the limit 60 hours on average over multiple weeks. Staff have attempted to accommodate both requests by giving licensees the option of choosing between a fixed 7-day period or a rolling 14-day period. In addition to this weekly limit, the REGDOC also includes one longer-term limit. The weekly limit gives licensees flexibility to schedule higher overtime levels short-term. The longer-term limit ensures that people in safety-sensitive positions are not consistently working 60 hours per week. Once again, some benchmarking data is included in this slide. The REGDOC includes limits on the number of consecutive shifts. The intent of limiting consecutive shifts is to restrict the buildup of sleep debt and related performance impairments. The next slide shows a relative comparison of fatigue levels associated with different numbers of consecutive shifts. Some of the benchmarking information in this table is shown graphically in slide 24. When requests were made by stakeholders to modify the limits in the REGDOC, staff considered the requests in light of science and benchmarking. As a final check, when considering requests from stakeholders, CNSC staff considered the rank ordering of limits in terms of anticipated levels of fatigue experienced. The relative fatigue levels, shown in this graph, were calculated using software that is based on fatigue science. The y-axis of the graph shows relative fatigue levels and has anchors of low at the bottom and high at the top. The x-axis shows various shift sequences. As a reference point, the first bar shows fatigue levels expected for a person who works 5 8-hour days from 9 to 5. All of the other bars represent 12-hour shifts. Moving along from left to right, the bars show 6 12-hour day shifts, 2 days followed by 2 nights, 3 nights, and so on up to the final bar of 6 consecutive 12-hour night shifts. This animation shows the limits of the REGDOC and shift sequences that are outside of what is permissible in the REGDOC. The final animation superimposes color to provide additional information about the requirements. Both the green and yellow portions of the graph are within the accepted practices in the regulatory document. For the 2 bars shown in yellow, the REGDOC includes guidance. For example, the REGDOC includes guidance that a normal work schedule should include 3 or fewer consecutive night shifts. When a mix of days followed immediately by nights are worked, the REGDOC includes guidance that a limit of 2 night shifts should apply. The guidance could be thought of as an administrative limit or advisable practice. The shift sequences shown in red are outside the limits of the REGDOC. So in this slide, I'd meant to animate this to make it easier to see. But moving from left to right, we've added in some benchmarking data. So it's the same graph as was shown on the last slide with a few extra points added in. So in France, workers are limited to 44 hours per week when work is done at night. Workers at nuclear plants in France work 8-hour shifts. The next point at 3 nights as we move along, the limit of 3 12-hour nights is in effect for all workers in Switzerland as well as for U.S. pilots. Transport Canada has proposed a similar limit for Canadian pilots. The next data point at 4 nights shows workers in Europe, including workers at nuclear plants. All workers in Europe have a limit of 8 hours per night on average for night work. Canadian motor carriers, shown at the second last blue bar to the right, are limited to 70 hours in a 7-day period. At the far end, nuclear workers in the U.S. are limited to 72 hours in any 7-day period. Although the U.S. NRC allows up to 6 nights, minimum day off requirements would prevent this from being done routinely. The U.S. NRC's requirements do not differentiate between days and nights. Although the REGDOC would allow for 6 consecutive day shifts, it sets more restrictive limits on night shifts due to the higher levels of fatigue associated with night work. This is the same graph shown again with sequences currently scheduled by licensees. OPG and Bruce Power normally schedule up to 3 consecutive 12-hour night shifts. CNL security workers are scheduled to work up to 2 12-hour day shifts, immediately followed by 3 night shifts. New Brunswick Power currently schedules up to 4 night shifts. As a note, all scheduled hours of work fall within the limits of the REGDOC. This is the same graph with upper limits of licensees shown. OPG and Bruce Power already have an upper limit of 4 consecutive nights and are within the limits of the REGDOC. CNL Security is currently permitted to work 2 days, followed immediately by 5 nights. MB Power currently allows up to 6 night shifts. I will now pass the presentation over to Monsieur Bouchard, who will discuss implementation.
André Bouchard for the record. If approved, REGDOC-2.2.4, Fitness for Duty Managing Workers' Fatigue, will be immediately published on the CNSC website following the Commission's decision. REGDOC-2.2.4 will be added to the Recommendation and Guidance sections of licensees' LCH. An implementation plan and timeline for including the REGDOC as compliance verification criteria in the LCH would be established through consultation between CNSC staff and each licensee. CNSC staff will monitor implementation progress. In the meantime, licensees' hours of work, which are currently compliance verification criteria in the License Condition Handbook, will remain for routine oversight. The next 2 slides provide an overview of the implementation challenges raised by New Brunswick Power and Canadian Nuclear Laboratories during consultation and again in letters to the Commission Secretary last week. New Brunswick Power has identified several sections of the REGDOC that they are currently meeting with their existing governance. Their key implementation challenges are related to 2 specific requirements: the limits of 4 consecutive 12-hour nights and the weekly or bi-weekly limits. New Brunswick Power indicated that they would also face challenges during outages. New Brunswick Power has proposed a phase-in approach with medium and long-term timeframes for implementations. New Brunswick Power communicated that they would need to increase certified staffing levels to be able to comply with the requirements of the REGDOC. Obtaining more qualified staff will take time. CNSC staff support New Brunswick Power's proposal for a phased-in approach. The details of the implementation timeframe and oversight will be developed with the licensee. Staff will monitor progress towards the full implementation of the REGDOC and propose to provide updates to the Commission in the annual regulatory oversight report for nuclear power plant. The Canadian Nuclear Laboratory, CNL, is the second licensee facing implementation challenges. During consultation, CNL has indicated that they have 2 key areas of concern. One is specific to NRU, and the second one is related to security shift schedules. To comply with all requirements, CNL would need to increase the number of certified staff for NRU. Since NRU will be shut down in roughly 14 months, increasing the number of certified staff at NRU is not a reasonable option. For security, CNL has implemented a schedule that includes components that are not aligned with the requirements on the REGDOC. In the letter submitted by CNL to the Commission Secretary last week, they have proposed that the REGDOC be modified to allow licensees to establish their own limits on hours of work for those in safety-sensitive positions. It is CNSC staff position that REGDOC-2.2.4 is based on fatigue science and benchmarking, and that the limits are necessary regulatory tools for managing the potential risks of human errors caused by fatigue. In that light, CNSC staff recommends that the Commission reject CNL's request to modify the REGDOC. Instead, CNSC staff recommends that CNL develop implementation measures in a reasonable time frame. In conclusion, REGDOC 2.2.4 was developed through extensive research, benchmarking, and consultation with all stakeholders. In response to feedback received during public consultation, the REGDOC has been modified to the extent possible, considering science and benchmarking. This regulatory document strengthened and modernized the CNSC's fitness for duty regulatory framework in the area of managing workers' fatigue. The approach taken balances the relative risks posed by various facilities and workers' position with the measures required to ensure workers' fatigue is effectively managed through a graded approach. This regulatory document improves clarity of the CNSC's expectations and provides a consistent basis for licensing and compliance activities across Canada. I will now turn the presentation over to Ms. Owen-Whitred for the recommendation.
Karen Owen-Whitred for the record. As such, CNSC staff believe that REGDOC-2.2.4, Fitness for Duty, Managing Worker Fatigue, is ready for final approval and publication. CNSC staff propose that any outstanding issues be addressed through implementation plans tailored to the specific circumstances of each licensee. Thank you for your attention, and we remain available for any questions you may have.
Thank you.